Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Poe, and today I'm doing week 47 of my 2019 reads. This week I finished 3 short story collections, which is quite a lot of short story collections to finish in one week, but they were all quite good. So the first collection that I finished was The Unreal and the Real Volume 2 by Ursula K Le Guin. This is a collection that I buddy read with Joe from FinalBlowJoe, who I will link below. And we actually started Volume 1 as well, but I ended up DNFing that within the first few stories. It was more literary fiction short stories, and they somehow really didn't work for me. But luckily, Volume 2, which was more of her fantasy and science fiction short stories, worked much better for me. I had a great time discussing these with Joe and trying to understand, what the point of some of these were, and just kind of getting our feelings and thinking about the stories as we read them. So that was a ton of fun. I really liked the stories in particular that had kind of a fairy tale feel, such as Semley's Necklace and The Rule of Names. Both of those felt like reading a fairy tale, except that there were some twists to them. I also really liked some of these stories which felt a little bit more reflective, introspective, and just had a little bit more to say about some social issues, such as Betrayals, which looks at making mistakes and then kind of coming to accept those mistakes and accept who you are and where your life path has gone, and Solitude, which looks at kind of different cultural values and how you deal with, if you're an immigrant to another place and your children grow up with the values of that place rather than your own, how do you deal with that? And, how do you reconcile those two? So there were some really great stories in here. There were also a couple of stories that weren't as interesting. They were more thought experiments or world building exercises without necessarily a firm narrative streak. And then there were a couple of stories that I actually found a little problematic. One of those is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Bree from BreeReadsBooks did a great video talking all about the sort of philosophy in this, so I will link that below in case you're interested. But this one had some issues with the way that it viewed disabled people, in that in this story there are some children who basically are abused, and other people think, oh, we could free them, but there wouldn't be any point because they've been neglected and abused and they won't be able to live a normal life after this, so we might as well just leave them there to suffer. And that's very problematic. I'll talk about another collection that I read in a few minutes, which actually has a response to that I thought was excellent, so I will talk about that soon. Another story that was problematic was The Wild Girls, which has a relationship between a slave and a master, where the slave sort of forgives the master for some pretty awful things and falls in love with him, and I'm not so sure that that's a great thing. I think that's quite problematic. And there was also another story called The Poacher, which has a rape scene that is not really addressed. It happens, and it's almost like it blends in with the rest of the story, and it doesn't stand out as something that's not okay. And I don't know for these stories if Le Guin was saying something against these issues, but they didn't feel called out enough to me, so they read pretty problematically. But again, it could be that I missed something, or it could be an issue of when this was written, but those I did have problems with. Overall, though, most of the stories were excellent, really interesting characters, really interesting worlds, beautiful writing, definitely lovely writing. So overall, I gave the collection 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I'll talk about Uncanny Magazine, issue 24, Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction. This was my final read that I was trying to wrap up for my disability reads for October. And I finally finished it. It took me a very long time, not because it wasn't good, but just because it was actually fairly long, almost 400 pages, and composed of very many short stories and essays and poetry and things like that. And it just took some time to process. There was a lot to think about with this. I'm going to go ahead and do a separate review of this because I really do want to talk a little bit about many of the different stories, and that'll take way too long. So maybe later this week I'll get that out. I also need to wrap up my disability priority month, so hopefully I'll get that out soon as well. But overall, this collection I thought was really strong. It's not that every short story was perfect, but the short stories all had something important to say about the perspective and the experience of being disabled, and they got so many different people to contribute. Half of this collection is short stories, and then there's some poems, and then quite a few nonfiction and kind of personal essays. And I thought that that was a beautiful balance. It gave a lot of insight into what it's like to have a disability, so many different types of disabilities. All of those perspectives are very unique and different, and what science fiction really means for people with disabilities. So I loved the different ways that people approach telling their short stories and telling their personal essays, and I thought it was not just really beautiful to read, but also gave me a lot of insight. So I highly recommend that you read this if you have any interest in science fiction short stories or anything to do with understanding kind of the disabled experience. This is a great place to start. Overall, I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. And lastly, I read my first Indigenous read for November, which is a bit late, but this is this month for me so far. I read This Place, 150 Years Retold. This is a graphic story collection by various Canadian Indigenous authors, and it was so cool. So basically, in this collection, each of the authors is telling the story of something that has happened in Indigenous history. And throughout all of the collection, there's also a timeline that talks about the different laws and events that happened in Canadian history that affected Indigenous peoples. And just seeing that timeline was eye-opening. I know that in the US, things have been pretty bad for Indigenous peoples, but I was under the impression that it wasn't as bad in Canada. And if it's not as bad in Canada, then wow, it was really awful in the US, because Canada was pretty awful. Some of those laws that were made and the things that happened were clearly designed for genocide. I mean, clearly designed for genocide. So that was really interesting. And each of the stories is sort of telling those histories. You know, the intro talked about how if history is told by the winners, that isn't really representative. And so they said, no, let's tell our histories. So many of these stories are just retellings of actual historical people or events. Some of them are kind of fictional histories where it's a fictionalized character, but talking about real events that happened. Some of them integrate mythology of the various tribes into what happened, and it's just such a fascinating collection. The art in each story is different. Some of the colors were really gorgeous, and they had a lot of integration of native words. So that was, I really liked reading that. Sometimes they're very long and very complicated, but it was so fun to see that, and so fun to learn about all of these different tribes. And there were so many different tribes from all over Canada represented. So I thought this was such a cool collection. Not every story was, fully gripping, but most of them were very good, and they all had something interesting to offer in terms of learning about that experience. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, and I really recommend that you try picking it up if you like graphic works or if you have any interest in Indigenous stories. So that wraps up week 47 for me. I'm really pleased with the books that I read this month, especially because I finally wrapped up my disability reads and got started on my Indigenous reads. I am going to try to get as much read as I can in the next couple of weeks. I'll go into December for my Indigenous reads because I'm not limiting myself to 1 week for them. But hopefully I'll get some more videos out in the next week or so. I haven't posted much in the past couple of weeks. We were out of town briefly, and that just kind of threw off my filming schedule, which happens. It happens to everybody. But I am looking forward to picking up more indigenous reads and seeing what I get done in the next couple weeks. Hope your reading is going well as well. And if you read any of the things that I mentioned today, or you have any other recommendations or anything that is interesting to talk about, go ahead and leave me a comment down below.